guys got on your chair. It's an annual event that really showcase and highlight some of the great UX that has happened throughout the year. Strongly suggest everybody check them out. It's a pretty good award ceremony. You get to see a lot of some really great stuff. Anything else?
No, good.
Great. So without further ado, let me all welcome Bev, a lovely and talented. Bev.
Thanks to Mark and Helena for having me here. I'm really excited to be talking about something that I'm really very passionate about, which is metrics. Typically, when I've been talking in the last few years in New York, I've been actually introducing other people, so it's nice to actually have an opportunity to talk about something that's important to me. And I'm going to be making this the most intense 45 minutes that you've ever sat through at a UX event, so hopefully you will learn something from it and get something out of it. I don't know how many people have had the experience that I've had where you've been in a client meeting or maybe talking to somebody internally, typically a more senior executive, and basically they dismiss any of your ideas or suggestions because they suggest that they're just your opinion. This is one thing that really drives me crazy, and it's happened to me plenty of times, both as a consultant and in-house. Some of the other excuses you might get to new ideas or suggestions you have, or we don't have time, we don't have money, we already know all about our users, we know our industry, or my favorite is, you should already know since you're the expert. Of course, we all know that these are just basically excuses to make sure that we don't do the critical step of research that's necessary as part of the UX process. And I call this like the wrong spelled excuse. So, there's the known knowns, the unknown knowns, and the unknown unknowns. And what we want to do is move this discussion out of the unknown knowns and into the known knowns. And it begs the question as to why people are so resistant to doing the kind of research that's going to give us the insights that we need to build great products. And ultimately, I think it's really just about fear. It's fear that they're going to be shown to have made the wrong decisions, fear that their product isn't performing as well as they had hoped, fear of whatever you might find that is potentially a threat to their current direction or their position or their decision making. So what that means is that if you're going to bring in metrics into your process, you better be able to both analyze and defend them. You can't just quote some numbers. You actually have to know what you're talking about. So that's what I'm here today for. I'm hoping that in 40 minutes I can give everyone at least a high-level, quick guide to some of the key web metrics to help them in their process. And I'm doing this because as part of Oxford Tech and UX, for the last 5.5 years we've been UX and product consultants, and increasingly we've been focusing on data and metrics and analytics as part of our process. Clients never come to us asking us to do data analytics or any kind of metrics. They come to us asking for UX, and it's up to us as UX practitioners to say, actually, this is a really important part of the process, and this is going to be our first step in it. And I come at this from a kind of unique background. I actually, 10 years ago to this month, worked for Wireless Generation, which is the precursor to Amplify, so it's funny that I'm here. I have an MBA plus went to ITP, so I have an unusual background for our industry where it's not just design focused but also business. And that's changed my direction and interest in this kind of work. So what we're going to be talking about today is really just, we're going to look at one case example from one of our clients. Then we're going to make it applicable to your own work with a quick step-by-step of how you can use this, go into some resources, and basically finish up. And as of like an hour from now, this will be up on SlideShare, so you don't have to take crazy notes or anything. You can actually go on SlideShare and you'll get the presentation. So there's lots of metrics out there, and especially because we're time constrained, we're really only going to be focusing on web metrics. So that's for desktop and mobile, and that's implemented as well as publicly available. Lots of other things you could use, but not for right now. Some of the key web metrics that are out there, for some of you this may be incredibly basic, but this is really going to be a primer for people who are not familiar with web metrics. They basically fall into 4 categories. you have metrics that are tracking traffic. And that's things like uniques and visits, where the traffic comes from. Then there's engagement metrics, which is what typically we care about most as UX practitioners, which is around time spent, number of page views per user, where people are going on the site, what they're doing. We also, of course, need to be considered with context, like what kind of device they're using, and of course demographics, who's coming to the site and why. You might notice that bounce rate is actually listed twice here under traffic or engagement. I think that's an interesting metric because sometimes bounce is dependent on the kind of traffic that's coming to the site based on the decisions that the marketers have made in terms of buying traffic. But other times it's a reflection of poor usability on the site and low engagement. So what does all this mean and why do I care? As a general rule, if you're talking about like a mid-sized or larger company, especially in New York, like in many of the sectors that are common here, you have a breakdown of responsibilities. And generally, the traffic metrics are going to be in the domain of the marketers. And as UX practitioners, we often don't have very much say in terms of what kind of traffic we get and where they're coming from. What we can influence is more what happens when they get there, what kind of engagement and experience they have on the site. And then as designers, we should care a lot about the context in terms of the operating system, display size, and things like that. And of course, everyone should care about the audience. There's lots of other metrics that you can use if you implement metrics on your site using core metrics, Google Analytics, etc. But they're not going to give you the competitive view that the publicly available metrics will. Some of the advanced things you can do, like heat map and click path analysis, will really help drill down into what's happening on your site. How do metrics work? It's worth talking about this for a minute because most metrics are just statistical samples. If the metric says you have 40 million uniques a month, it doesn't mean they actually tracked 40 million people coming to your site a month. It means they tracked a representative sample, probably 400K or something like that, and then they extrapolated based on that number that represented 40 million uniques. And that's important to remember because it means that the metrics that you're looking at are, broadly speaking, quite inaccurate. They're approximations, they're not absolutes. And if you have low traffic coming to your site, anything less than 1 million, the public web metrics are probably not going to be very useful for you at all. You'll have to rely on whatever you implement on your site. Also, if you clear your cookies, every time you clear your cookies, that means various people can't track you, and so that's the kind of thing that's influencing these numbers. But before we dive into what these metrics are, we have to decide what we're trying to accomplish. The numbers in themselves are basically meaningless. We have to know what the business is trying to accomplish, and then also what the user wants and what the user goals are. So the first thing is actually really strategic to figure that out, and deciding what your key KPIs or key performance metrics are that you're going to evaluate your site by. And by the way, the goals of the business and the audience may well conflict. In a publishing environment, for example, historically, the publisher might want the visitor to see the maximum ads and then have the maximum page views per visit to boost their numbers, while the visitor probably wants their minimum page views per visit and no ads to find the content that they're looking for. So it's up to us working with the product and executive leads in any company to figure out what the actual goals are that are going to determine both. You are going to have standards that are going to vary based on the industry and based on the role and responsibility of the person. So a video-driven site is not going to have the same KPIs as a social site, or it shouldn't. And now those are the things that are going to drive the UX strategy. The UX then should be designed to be optimized to meet the metrics that are going to suit both the audience needs and the business needs. So recapping in terms of what's important for UX, in most scenarios, we actually can't influence the marketing unless we're doing, quote, social UX. So what we care about are the demographics metrics, anything to do with the design and devices, and everything to do with engagement. By the way, metrics have relevance for every single step in the life cycle. It isn't just at the end when you're testing live sites. So at the beginning, we're trying to figure out our strategy and what we're trying to do. And that's where we're defining the business and audience KPIs, as well as looking at the demographics in terms of who our customers are. Then we're getting into the strategy, and we're looking at both our competitors and our current experience if we're trying to improve in a current site. And we're going to be evaluating them based on those same metrics. And then when it gets into concepting, we're going to be trying to move the needle on whatever those metrics are to get better numbers. And then when we get into prototyping, we can actually test and evaluate. Finally, we release, and then through the build, measure, learn cycle, ideally we improve what's launched. There's a lot of existential questions around metrics, and we're not going to get into all of those today. For example, you can debate what does it mean to have a scroll, how does that impact a page view. 10 years ago, we would have had that same conversation around Flash, and it's just sort of noise. It really depends on how you code it. And the biggest question, of course, is whether you even care about page views at all for your particular project. So diving right into a case study that we're going to use as an example. In the last couple of months, I have consulted for a major TV and media client here in New York, and hopefully that data will remain anonymous in the way that I'm representing it here. So as part of that engagement, we did a very deep dive in terms of competitive analysis and site analysis. And we delivered boatloads of data to them. And we will only be showing a tiny sampling here to give you a sense. So we looked at their competitors, and we did a deep dive analysis on their metrics. We took that in, we put it in a spreadsheet first before we made the PowerPoint, and then we had a competitive heuristic evaluation of those same sites to see how did they meet those numbers? What experience did they have that actually created those numbers? We then did that same thing internally where we looked at the on-site metrics, and then we did an evaluation of the sites to see what were they doing and why did those, what exactly was on the site that caused those numbers to be the way that they were. And then that led into how we were driving our concepting in terms of new ideas and approaches. So as part of that first deliverable, the competitive metrics analysis, that was an 80-page PowerPoint, and you've got like maybe 2 or 3 slides that I'll show you from that. These are just a sampling of some of the slides, and you can see there's lots of pretty charts and graphs that basically will show how this particular competitor compares to all of their competitive set for each one of the metrics that we just looked at. So it had been page views, uniques, page views per user, time spent, bounce, every single thing you saw, we looked at how they compared. And we looked at also mobile and social metrics as well. See, here's a sampling of that approach. So in this particular case, this was a close-up on traffic sources for this particular competitive set based on what percentage of traffic went to their site from social media. And we got this from a similar web. In this case, as you can see, we took in the data and then we sorted it from highest to low, and then we graphed it, and we also color-coded it based on the type of competitor. Because in this case, let's say with TV and media, it's really not fair to let's say, compare aetv.com way here on the lower right to, let's say, a YouTube. We have to sometimes compare apples to apples. So there are times when it is important to do that kind of comparison because you can learn from the big guns or improve on them sometimes, but there's other times when you want to know that you're looking at a more similar competitive set. So in this case, we coded it by 5 colors. Red happened to mean blogs, blue was network sites, purple was video platform sites, yellow was social, and green was traditional media. You could argue that for many of these sites, maybe they should have been in a different category or whatever, but that is, a subjective decision that we made. And then when we looked at this, we saw here that you'll see that of this, amazingly, of Comedy Central, The Onion, and BuzzFeed on the far left there, over 50% of their traffic is coming from social. That's like quite an accomplishment. So we looked at the high performers in social, and we did a further breakdown of exactly what their traffic looked like. Another example of some of the analysis we did is we looked at just traffic over time. So we didn't just say, here's their snapshot of how your competitors are doing. We tried to look for trends. You can see, just looking at this map, that some of the competitors had an increase in traffic and others stayed kind of the same, but it gives you a good sense of where you fit in the hierarchy. Similarly for engagement and time spent. Now this one was really interesting, and this is a perfect case where sometimes when you do this, you find really interesting things that you wouldn't have expected. Like here on the far left, you'll notice that iTunes is completely killing it over YouTube, The Onion, Netflix, and Hulu in terms of time spent. So that either means that there's something wrong with the data, which is entirely possible, or it means that iTunes is doing something phenomenal. In the case of Netflix, we know that that has to be an outlier because people watch long-form video on Netflix. So how could it possibly be that The Onion is killing them on time spent? And you'll see later that Netflix is an outlier that I'm going to use as an example of data that we found that was definitely wrong. So what we did is we took all this data from all these sites. We went to Alexa, Compete, Quantcast, SimilarWeb, and other sites, and we took the data and then we basically either downloaded it or manually transcribed it into massive spreadsheets. And the most important thing to do is to make sure you're writing down all the details that you might forget to do at the time, like the exact source, the exact date range, the exact metric you're documenting. So here on the upper left, you'll see it was weeks, which in this case, Quantcast calls people, from December 2012 to December 2013. And then we added in an average column just to help us get a sense. And I'm going to get out of this for a second and show you what these sites look like, so you can find out for yourself. So here in Quantcast, for example, this is Netflix. It's saying that I've got 7 million uniques, and the date range is 6 months. You can easily see how you might get the wrong data by just having it be on 3 months instead of 6 months, and then you'd be actually writing down the inaccurate information. Here it is on Compete. These are all free sites. You can use them for any big site. It's telling us that they've got 41 million uniques. My favorite is this new site, SimilarWeb, which is super awesome and the most accurate. It gives you the most for free. And it tells me all kinds of stuff. It's telling me visits, and it's telling me totally different numbers. It's telling me 136 million visits per week for the same site. So clearly there's some inconsistencies here. SimilarWeb is also telling me about traffic sources and lots of other stuff. And lastly, there's Alexa, which gives you a little more data on, let's say, gender and education and browsing locations, stuff like that. So we took all that data, we put it into spreadsheets, we made those pretty charts and graphs, and we also plotted it. So this data here looks like this once we plotted it. Once we plotted it over time, we saw something funky. Here you can see Discovery goes from 10 million uniques to nothing, and then it flatlines. Well, as we know, Discovery didn't die. So clearly when you look at this is where you have to put your thinking cap on and say, they must have done a new release where they somehow did something with the coded analytics and something changed, because there's no way that that can possibly be true. So you can't just take these numbers, you actually have to think through it. And that's where doing some of this work manually, doing the sorting, doing the prioritizing, and doing the averages can help you, because you have to actually examine the data and think about what you're doing. So we put in manual averages for many other different kinds of data, and then we were able to plot it. So these spreadsheets, for example, became these pretty charts and graphs, and then it was easy to see exactly where you fit in the hierarchy. We did the same with plenty of other different types of content. So here, for example, we looked at all the apps for all the competitors and based on their ratings. So who gets 5-star rating, 3-star rating, etc. You can then use this and say, okay, well, obviously, we can pretty much assume that if something has a 5-star rating versus a 1.5-star rating, it's probably a better experience. So let's go look at what those 5-star rating site apps did, and if we need to compress and pick and choose, we're going to skip the 1.5-star ones. So after that, then we looked at the competitors with our own eyes and our expert perception as UX professionals. So many of us are familiar with doing heuristic evaluations, where you look at a site, you document usability, you look at the navigation, you look at how people go through it, you have a checklist of best practices. And we did a 134-page version of that across all these competitors, where we looked at exactly their logged-in state, what the video player looked like, etc., etc. And you can see here, even at this resolution, that we had screenshots with little notes. So, for example, we looked at Netflix's logged-in state, and we saw exactly how would you get your content. And the goal of this was that we were looking at the metrics and we were looking at the top performers, and then we were going and looking with our own eyes at the site to figure out what were they doing that accomplished those numbers. And it is subjective, but since you know that some sites are performing better than others, that gives you a roadmap in terms of who you might want to look at. And then we actually quantified our own analysis. So we didn't just leave it like this, where we had basically screenshots and commentary. What we did is we defined our evaluation criteria. So in this case, we were looking at what sites allowed for optimum social sharing. So we had these certain characteristics that we were evaluating the sites against based on who has the best social sharing. And then we actually numbered them on a scale of 1 to 5, put that stuff in Excel, and plotted it in the same way. So we basically gave the next level of analysis and rigor to our own approach in evaluating sites. And this is really useful to clients because it isn't just perception where you're saying, hey, this is not working or whatever. You're giving them a much broader sense of like, who's really got an amazing experience and why. Then we compared, we went in and looked at their internal data. So all the stuff that we've done to date was looking at competitors. Now we turned and we looked inward and we looked at their amateur, ComScore, and Nielsen data. Same thing, a large presentation, lots of pretty charts and graphs. This stuff we got straight from the source. We didn't need to manually transcribe it or anything. And we were able to go into much greater detail in specific areas. We were able to see things like what are the top sections of the site and that people are going to? What are the top paths that people are going to through the site? So a path, as you probably know, is when a user, let's say, clicks on the home page, then goes to section A, then goes to page A, and then they exit. If 40% of the people do that, then that's one path. Maybe 20% of the people are going to a different section, and then they're clicking on something different, and then they exit. So you can try and get a sense of where the aggregate traffic is going through your site, and then you can help to optimize the experience to manipulate that. On-site metrics can also give you a lot more data in terms of what's happening on mobile versus desktop web, where people are going, exactly granular detail of how long they're staying on the site, and also click path analysis. So here's the visual version of the click path analysis from the home page. When users come into the home page, the top 10 places that they go after that and the percentages, and then break down even further from where they go from there. So this can give you a real sense of where to optimize, because if you want to prioritize your time, you want to prioritize the high value pages where most people are going. And sometimes it's not the home page. So then we did the same thing. We looked at the site and we did a heuristic evaluation. And we took lots of screenshots and we made a lot of notes and we made commentary about what was working and what wasn't. And it was based on the metrics that we had taken. So we knew already what the pain points were just looking at the numbers, and then we were able to look and do a deep dive into the actual experience and see what was actually happening that was driving that.
Question, can you go back to the slide? How do you, the next one, how do you know from here which ones are getting more traffic than others?
Well, you can't see at this resolution, but it'll actually tell you the percentages. So it'll tell you, like here it says, 4% of people took